Before we really dig into the meat of this video, I just want to come clean right off the bat and say that I am partially making this video out of spite. Why am I making this video out of spite? Well, let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, I was a university student, nearing the end of my bachelor's degree, and I had finished my first and second major, and I needed some electives to burn. So I decided to take a summer course in the art history department that was all about the art history of the Old and Middle Kingdoms of ancient Egypt. One of the majors I was just wrapping up was in Greek and Roman studies, so I thought a nice little foray into art history, and in art history of Egypt no less, would be a nice little way to cap off my degree. Now, the university that I went to did have a classics department, but during the numerous years that I went there, I never once saw a course on Egypt or on Egyptology. So I saw this course being offered on ancient Egypt and I got kind of excited. I didn't really look too closely at this class, as I just assumed that the professor was visiting from another university, but ultimately I didn't care, as I trusted the university to have someone who actually knew what they were talking about teach this course. The first couple weeks of the course were fine. I think the professor gave like a bit of an ancient Egyptian historical overview, but I don't remember very much from the early parts of the course, as this was in 2014. But as the course went on, I began to notice that the professor kept mentioning this man by the name of Flinders Petrie, who was a British antiquarian and archaeologist who excavated all over Egypt in the 19th century. As the weeks progressed, I began to notice that the professor was talking more and more about Flinders Petrie and other 19th century antiquarians, and less about what the course was actually advertised to be about. We were leaving behind the discussions of art history in the Old and Middle Kingdoms of ancient Egypt and moving more towards discussions of British archaeologists in the 19th century. I was at first really interested in this subject matter, but there were a couple little red flags that made me begin to realize that something wasn't right. I was beginning to lose faith that my professor, who I was paying a lot of money to teach me, didn't actually know what they were talking about when it came to ancient Egyptian history. It all came to a head one day when the professor was once again talking about Flinders Petrie, and I had a thought. They were talking about Petrie and a few other British archaeologists, but where were the Egyptians in this story? So I put up my hand and I asked the professor, where were the Egyptian Egyptologists? And the professor, very promptly and with absolutely no hesitation, said, there weren't any. So just marinate on that for a second. This person, who I had paid hundreds of dollars to go and sit in a lecture hall and listen to them talk about Egypt, said that not one single Egyptian in the 19th century was interested in their own ancient history. So the professor carried on with their lecture. And I clocked out mentally, and I pulled out my phone and I started typing in Egyptian Egyptologists 19th century into Google. And shockingly, there were results. So that, my friends, is why I am here today, to tell you about some of Egypt's Egyptologists. Because I am spiteful about the fact that I once paid a university to tell me that they didn't exist. However, while doing the research for this video, I came to the realization that this professor's incompetence wasn't entirely their fault. They probably still shouldn't have taught this course, but I digress. There were Egyptian Egyptologists, but everything I could find about them was kind of buried, so I started digging. Let's talk about these unsung heroes. Before we start dropping names and bibliographies, I think it's really important to lay the groundwork and talk not only about what was happening in Egypt in the 19th century, but also to talk a little bit about the history of the field of Egyptology. I think the best place to start with both of these topics is with a gentleman who you might have heard of, named Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1798, Napoleon, as first consul of France, conquered Egypt. There were a number of different reasons for this move. For example, it provided the French with an avenue to India and also opened them up to numerous ports in the Mediterranean, and overall just gave the French a little bit of an economic boost. However, to be brief, this land was conquered by the French, so it would give them an advantage over their worst enemy, the British. France only controlled Egypt for a few years, but it would have a resounding impact on not only the Egyptian people who lived there, but also on the study of ancient Egypt. Because you see, Napoleon didn't just bring soldiers with him. He also brought artists, engineers, scholars, and geographers who all took an interest in the physical and historical landscape of Egypt. Many of these savants worked together on a publication called the Description de l'Egypte, which brought a large amount of information about Egypt and its ancient history to large audiences of Europe for the first time. Ancient Egyptian history wasn't totally unknown, but with this sudden spike of European interest in Egypt, combined with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, it would propel the interest in ancient Egypt into a larger field of academic study. In his book, Who's Pharaohs by Donald Malcom Reid, he states that Egyptology was born amid violence, imperialism, and Anglo-French rivalry. When the European academics returned home, they brought pieces of Egypt with them, both physically and incorporeally. Not only did they bring artifacts, mummies, statues, and pieces of temples home with them, they were bringing home the idea of an undiscovered ancient world that Europeans believed the local Egyptian people were too barbaric to appreciate or acknowledge. Europe couldn't get enough of ancient Egypt, so they returned over and over again until finally they just decided to set up shop. Europeans played key roles in founding the Egyptian Antiquities Service, which sought to slow the tide of Egyptian antiquities leaving the country and also to prevent illegal excavation. This was good as it allowed a more methodical approach to archaeology. However, it did result in a fair amount of prejudice against anyone whom the service did not deem fit to excavate. The prejudice unfortunately applied to some local Egyptian academics, as they were ironically seen as being driven by their desire for buried treasure. On top of the Antiquities Service, Europeans were involved in the establishment of 4 different museums between 1858 and 1908, including the Egyptian Museum, the Greco-Roman Museum, the Coptic Museum, and the Museum of Arabic, which is now Islamic, art. There were early attempts made by Egyptians to establish an Antiquities Service and open a national museum. However, due to numerous different reasons, many of these plans fell through. I think it's important to note that the 4 museums that I just mentioned were all under the direction, or were at the very least heavily dominated, by Europeans well until the 1950s when the Egyptian monarchy fell. The European academic interest extended far beyond the walls of these 4 museums, and by the end of the 19th century, Egyptomania was in full swing. The great exhibitions of the 19th century fully embraced this craze. First at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, followed by numerous other exhibitions that featured Egyptian exhibits or displays. In the 1889 Paris exhibition, it featured an attraction called A Street of Cairo. This display recreated a street of the Egyptian capital, complete with real parts of demolished buildings from the city, as well as real Egyptian people, vendors, belly dancers, donkeys, and baked goods. This interest in ancient Egypt was so widespread that it would go on to influence European and North American theater, fashion, home decor, and popular culture by the end of the 19th century. Even today, there are tons of movies and stories about this period of 19th century discovery and archaeology in Egypt. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to Egyptology figureheads like Flinders Petrie, Jean-François Champollion, Heinrich Brugsch, and Howard Carter, but not much academic work has been done on the Egyptian academics and linguists who studied their own ancient history. I once again refer to the words of Donald Malcom Reid. Egyptians flicker in the shadows as trusty foremen, loyal servants, laborers, tomb robbers, antiquities dealers, obstructionist officials, and benighted nationalists. The purpose of Donald Malcom Reid's work, and also the purpose of this video, is not to devalue or degrade the work done by European academics, but rather to challenge the idea that there were no Egyptians studying their own ancient history. Despite numerous European curators, archaeologists, and government officials doing everything they could to keep Egyptians out of their academic circles, they were there. theme with many of the Egyptian Egyptologists that I'm going to talk about today is their education. Most of them were educated at some point in either France or Germany, and they would all either go on to run or at the very least to attend a school of Egyptology. The first Egyptologist that I would like to discuss is Rifa al-tahtawi. Al-Tahtawi was born in 1801 and died in 1873, and he was actually not your typical Egyptologist. He did not excavate, and he was unable to read the elusive hieroglyphs that were appearing on all of these newly discovered tombs and temples. Al-Tahtawi is very important to this story though, as he was drumming up interest about ancient Egypt among contemporary Egyptians. At this point in time, the Egyptian general public was far more interested in the Islamic history of their nation. There was no pyramid iconography on the Egyptian postage, no mummies or stylized drawings of temples on any of the stamps or pamphlets of Egypt at the time. Suffice to say that the ancient history of Egypt hadn't become a part of their national identity yet. With the rise of Western Egyptology and this sudden interest in this facet of the ancient world, local Egyptians were getting swept up in it too. Where the West had their own Egyptomania, Egypt also underwent something similar that resulted in a strong sense of national pride. But I was talking about Rifa al-Tahtawi, a writer, a scholar, a teacher, a translator, and an Egyptologist. His work as a translator is something that I want to touch on briefly. While he was not on the excavation site pulling antiquities out of the ground, he still had a very big appreciation for them, and he actually learned lots of necessary languages so that he would be able to be a star mediator between Europe and Egypt. Not only that, he was translating French works about ancient Egypt into Arabic, and this helped the everyday Egyptian be able to further connect with their ancient history, as they were able to almost be a part of these new discoveries being made every day across their country. In 1835, he was also a part of something big, something that I actually mentioned earlier. Europe ultimately got their hooks into the antiquities service early, but there was an attempt made by Mohammad Pasha as well as Rifa al-Tahtawi to make a homegrown antiquities service. In 1835, Muhammad Ali Pasha issued a decree banning the exportation of Egyptian antiquities from Egypt. Another decree, issued later in the same year, announced the establishment of a museum in Cairo where all of these antiquities would be transferred. Specifically, that these antiquities should be transferred to one Rifa al-Tahtawi. While this Egyptian antiquities service fell apart, the National Museum was built next to a school that al-Tahtawi actually founded in the same year. His School of Languages would go on to educate a number of Egyptian Egyptologists, teaching them all of the necessary languages that they would need to be able to keep up with the European scholars who were dominating and overrunning the field of Egyptology. The next Egyptian Egyptologist I want to talk about is Ali Pasha Mubarak. He is very similar to al-Tahtawi in the sense that neither of them were really boots-on-the-ground archaeologists, but the work that they did as historians, teachers, and as government officials would lay the academic groundwork for future Egyptian scholars. Ali Mubarak was a very educated man. He was educated at the Cairo School of Engineering, spent a little bit of time with his education in France, and also did a short stint in the French army. When he returned to Egypt in 1849, Ali Mubarak secured a government position. In this position, he sought to modernize Egypt. He wanted to tackle everything from urban planning to railway infrastructure. But he had a very special interest in overhauling the Egyptian school system. As part of this school system overhaul, he recognized the need for a school of Egyptology. During this time, Egypt really wanted to start producing its own Egyptologists who could work alongside the Europeans in the antiquities service and in the numerous museums. Unsurprisingly, many Europeans in these positions opposed this. The racist and colonial attitudes held by these officials was further enforced by the fact that they felt that their positions were being threatened. However, due to the ongoing rivalries and squabbles of the European academics and government officials, a small opportunity presented itself. Ali Mubarak hired a German by the name of Heinrich Brugsch for the position of directing a school of Egyptology in 1869. It is noted that Brugsch successfully opened the school in a rat and bat-infested villa near the Biluk Museum with 10 students in this school. They were also brought on field trips to other countries, as well as on detailed tours through Upper Egypt. The school closed in 1874, but unfortunately it seemed like a bygone conclusion almost from the start. As I mentioned, several Europeans were opposed to this school for a variety of different reasons, ranging from the belief in which they saw themselves as superior to the Egyptian people, to simply feeling that with a larger pool of people to vie for these positions, it would become more difficult to find a paying position with the service or in one of the museums. Having had decades of control over these institutions by this point, I'm sure it came as no surprise to the Europeans that at some point the Egyptians might want to manage their own antiquity service. One European, a Frenchman by the name of François-Auguste Ferdinand Mariette, stands out as being especially ruthless among these opposers. For some context, Mariette was one of the primary founders of the Antiquity Service as well as the Egyptian Museum. As a result, he had a lot of power in these circles, and he made it very clear to his friend Brugsch, who was teaching this new generation of Egyptian academics, just how opposed he was to the idea of an Egyptian Egyptologist. Mariette was not only partially responsible for the closing of the school, but at one point he actually gave the order to museum officials that no local, no native Egyptian should be allowed to transcribe hieroglyphs within the museum. The School of Egyptology that Ali Mubarak helped to build may have closed, but the 10 students of Heinrich Brugsch still received several years of education, and though they were transferred around to various government positions, some did indeed return to Egyptology. One of the most well-known Egyptian Egyptologists, in fact. The career of Ahmed Pasha Kamal was not easy. It was fraught with what I can only imagine as disappointing and infuriating setbacks, as he was an Egyptian man trying to find his place within a colonial institution that actively despised everything he stood for. Kamal likely read the textbooks of al-tahtawi and was likely the type of person that Ali Mubarak envisioned when he first founded the School of Egyptology. He was a late academic bloomer in comparison to his European Egyptologist counterparts, but he did succeed, and he even managed to open a small school with one graduating class before it closed in 1883. He was eventually hired by the Antiquities Service, but this was only granted to him because the head of the service at the time did not want to see a Brit in the role of assistant curator. But he was hired by the service, and he worked for them for many years, even going so far as to submit 29 different items to their annual publication. Many of his submissions were fairly short, as they just covered follow-up excavations or summarized inspectors' notes when it came to inspecting sites that had been illicitly excavated. On that note, I will remind you that many Egyptians were denied digging permits, as in the words of a previous head of the Antiquity Service, one Gaston Maspero, stated that Egyptians were just treasure hunters and lacked scientific passion. As I mentioned, over the years, Ahmed Kamal would frequently be passed over for promotion in favor of younger and often less experienced European academics. Despite this, though, he continued to work and he continued to write. In 1909, it seemed like he was finally getting the recognition that he deserved, and he actually taught a course at the newly founded Egyptian University. To follow up, he actually convinced the Minister of Education to open an Egyptology section in the Higher Teachers College in 1910. He was successful, and he actually lectured there twice a week to a small class of 7 students. He was also successful in convincing provincial authorities to establish smaller local museums throughout the country, and in doing so, he actually helped out another Egyptian Egyptologist. He helped one Ahmed Pasha obtain a digger's permit, and as a result, all of the discoveries at his excavation not only went to the local museum, but also some of those discoveries went back to the National Museum in Cairo. By the time Kamal retired in 1914, he had translated numerous works from French Egyptologists like Gaston Maspero and Jacques de Morgan. On top of that, he had also written an ancient history of Egypt in Arabic, as well as a hieroglyphic grammar. He also wrote a 22-volume dictionary where he tried to link the different linguistic roots between ancient Egyptian, Arabic, and other languages in the surrounding region. Unfortunately, he died before it was completed, and the colonial powers that be prevented it from being published. 80 years after his death, it was finally compiled and published in 2003 by the Antiquities Service, no less. He also wrote articles for the general public in the Al-Haram newspaper, and was just consistently persistent with his intent to establish Egyptology as a formal academic field in Egypt. Just as he was inspired by his predecessors, Ahmed Kamal would go on to facilitate a whole new generation of Egyptian Egyptologists. I only really spoke in detail about 3 Egyptian Egyptologists, but I want to make it explicitly clear that there were many, many more. Contrary to what a certain professor once said, there were obviously many Egyptians who were interested in their own ancient history, but they were prevented from really engaging with it to the same level as European academics due to the colonial powers and systems that were omnipresent in Egypt during this time. The work of a lot of these Egyptian Egyptologists is still kind of being uncovered, but with a lot of museums and cultural heritage institutions in general looking inwards at their colonial roots, I think that we're going to see a lot more scholarship be published in the next couple of years about these people. That being said, if you want to learn more about this period of the rediscovery of ancient Egypt and the contemporary Egyptian side of things, I cannot recommend the work of Donald Malcom Reid enough. His book, Who's Pharaohs, greatly shaped the script for this video, and also was just a really interesting and captivating read that gave lots of different comparisons, and you just get a really good overview of the history of Egyptology, and it's as charitable to the Egyptians as it is to the Europeans, so you kind of learn a little bit about how these powers worked in tandem to create Egyptology as the field it is today. I also stumbled across an academic who I believe is Egyptian, Dr. Fatima Keshk, and she actually spoke with Kamal's grandson. And she's also recently done a lecture, which is available for free on YouTube, about Ahmed Kamal, which I will link in the description down below. Despite this video being made partially out of spite, as I gave a couple $100 to a professor who had no idea what they were talking about, I actually really enjoyed putting this video together, and I actually learned a lot by reading the book by Donald Malcom Reid, as well as listening to the lecture by Dr. Keshk. But I was really excited to put this video together, and I hope you enjoyed learning about these people with me, these unsung heroes of Egyptology. And I'm looking forward to seeing how more stories about these people or people like them come about, not just in Egyptology, but in other historical or museum-related fields around the world. With all that being said, this is the end of the video. Thank you very much for tagging along till the end. I have all of those links in the description. Feel free to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more and all of that good stuff. Mortals Season 2 has also just started, so feel free to check out the podcast that's all about death and death rites that I am a co-host of on any of your podcatchers. But thanks for sticking around, and I'll see you next time.